What if the clearest proof of a broken promise wasn't a leaked document or a whistleblower testifying somewhere, but a single photograph taken from 300 miles above the Iranian desert? Stay with me on this one, because the details matter more than the headline itself ever could on its own. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who follows Middle East news closely, because this story reveals something most coverage has completely missed. Sometime in late June, a commercial satellite passing high above Iran captured an image of a patch of desert southeast of Tehran. Nobody on the ground noticed. No alarms went off. A machine in orbit simply did what it was built to do and kept moving. It would take days before analysts back on Earth understood exactly what that frame proved. And once they lined it up against a second image taken roughly 2 weeks later, the picture that emerged wasn't just evidence of ordinary construction work. It was evidence of a government rebuilding a nuclear weapons facility, while formally, publicly bound, by a signed agreement to freeze exactly that kind of activity. That contradiction, a country reconstructing precisely the infrastructure it had just promised to leave untouched, during the exact window when it assumed no one was watching, sits underneath every headline this story has generated since. Understanding why these particular images landed with so much force and why their release looks less like coincidence and more like a deliberate decision by someone in Washington requires slowing down and taking this apart piece by piece, because the surface-level headline barely scratches what's actually going on here. To understand why a couple of satellite photographs of a construction site could genuinely shake an entire diplomatic process, you have to go back further than this month, further than this year even. Iran's nuclear infrastructure didn't become a flashpoint in 2026. That happened in June 2025, during what's now widely referred to as the 12-Day War, when Israeli strikes tore into the country's enrichment and weapons testing network at a scale nobody had previously attempted. One facility sat right at the center of everything that's unfolded since, an underground site called Taligan II, tucked inside the sprawling Parchin military complex southeast of Tehran. Experts who track Iran's weapons program believe Taligan II was used specifically to store and test explosive components tied to nuclear weapons development, not civilian power generation. It was struck by Israeli forces in October 2024, subsequently rebuilt, and then struck a second time in March 2026. Independent researchers who've traced the site's history describe this as the second full attempt at reconstruction in under 2 years, each time using slightly more sophisticated concealment methods than the last. By any ordinary accounting, that second strike should have marked the end of that particular chapter, at least for a while. But ordinary accounting has never really applied to Iran's nuclear program, because this specific pattern isn't new at all. After earlier rounds of strikes, satellite imagery from firms like Planet Labs began picking up something unusual at 2 other closely watched sites, Natanz and Isfahan. Not full reconstruction exactly, something simpler and, in its own way, more revealing. New roofs, straightforward structures built directly over bomb-damaged buildings, roofs that serve essentially one purpose, blocking the view from above. Independent analysts studying those images were fairly blunt about what they meant. Iran wasn't necessarily rebuilding its enrichment capacity yet. It was making absolutely sure nobody could see what it was doing next. And directly south of Natanz's outer perimeter, at a mountain locals call Ku-e-Kolan Gazla, more widely known in English language coverage as Pickaxe Mountain, excavation work that had quietly begun back in 2023 kept steadily expanding. Dirt piles grew larger. Tunnels pushed deeper into the mountainside. Analysts tracking the site believe Iran has been building an entirely new underground enrichment facility there, one designed from the very start to withstand exactly the kind of strikes that leveled Natanz and Isfahan. Separate imagery from that same window in late June reportedly showed a steady stream of vehicles entering and leaving the tunnel entrances at Pickaxe Mountain, ordinary logistical traffic on the surface, but the kind of traffic that only makes sense if meaningful work is genuinely continuing somewhere deep inside. That's the backdrop sitting behind everything that's happened since. A regime rebuilding quietly in the shadows, even while publicly insisting its nuclear ambitions had been set back for years by military action. Then came the diplomacy. On June 17th of this year, Iran and the United States finalized a 14-point memorandum of understanding, a framework intended to freeze Iranian nuclear activity in exchange for the gradual release of financial assets that had been frozen for years. It was fragile from the very beginning, built on a level of mutual distrust that left almost everyone involved genuinely skeptical it would ever hold together for long. But for a handful of weeks, it did hold. Strikes paused. Diplomatic channels running through Oman stayed open. Both governments had at least a temporary political incentive to be seen honoring their end of the arrangement, which is exactly what makes the timing of everything that happened next so difficult to explain away as pure coincidence. It's worth remembering just how unusual it is for Washington and Tehran to have any functioning diplomatic channel at all, let alone one producing a signed 14-point document. That alone tells you both governments believed, at least briefly, that there was something genuinely worth salvaging here. Here's the part of this story that deserves a slower, more careful explanation than it usually gets, because the mechanics behind how this particular set of images actually became public are almost more revealing than the images themselves. For months, the US government had maintained fairly tight restrictions on commercial satellite companies, effectively limiting how firms distributed high-resolution imagery of sensitive sites across Iran and the wider region. That restriction wasn't incidental or accidental. Controlling who gets to see what's happening on the ground is itself a meaningful form of narrative control during an active, ongoing conflict, the kind of quiet leverage governments rarely acknowledge exercising in public. And then, for a brief window spanning late June into early July, that restriction was quietly loosened, just long enough for new commercial imagery to become available again, just long enough for CNN, working directly with analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security, to obtain images from a commercial satellite provider, showing precisely what was happening at Taliban 2 during that exact stretch of time. The images themselves tell a genuinely specific story once you understand how to actually read them. The first set, captured on June 22nd, showed activity that initially looked like ordinary cleanup work, excavation around bomb penetration holes in the facility's roof, debris being cleared away, the kind of work you'd reasonably expect from any government simply assessing the extent of damage it had suffered. That much isn't unusual on its own. Any country hit by precision strikes wants to understand exactly what survived and what didn't. But the second set of images, captured on July 7th, showed something categorically different: additional concrete reinforcement, the apparent installation of rebar mesh, specifically the kind of preparation typically associated with pouring a new permanent concrete roof. That's not damage assessment anymore, and no reasonable analyst would mistake it for that. That's the early architecture of genuine reconstruction. And according to the timeline analysts laid out, it was happening roughly 3 weeks after Iran had signed an agreement explicitly committing to freeze exactly this category of activity. It's worth pausing to understand how this kind of analysis actually works, because this isn't loose guesswork dressed up as certainty. Satellite imagery analysts don't simply glance at a single photo and jump to conclusions. They compare sequential images of the exact same coordinates over time, carefully tracking specific, measurable physical changes. A pile of excavated dirt that grows larger between two passes tells you excavation is actively ongoing. A gap in a roofline that visibly shrinks between two passes tells you something is being rebuilt directly over it. Vehicle tracks appearing where none previously existed tell you equipment or personnel recently moved through the area. None of this requires access to classified intelligence whatsoever. It's built entirely from commercially available imagery, cross-referenced against known site layouts and structural history, which is exactly why this kind of open-source analysis has become such a genuinely powerful tool for tracking nuclear proliferation activity worldwide. Analysts working this way often maintain running archives stretching back years for a single facility, so a single new image rarely gets interpreted in isolation. It gets slotted into a much longer visual timeline, one that makes deliberate concealment considerably harder to disguise as routine repair work. It also means Iran can't easily dispute what these images actually show, because the exact same imagery remains available to any government, journalist, or independent researcher willing to pay for satellite access. That's a fundamentally different kind of pressure than an intelligence agency simply making an accusation behind closed doors. This is a receipt sitting out in the open that essentially anyone can go verify for themselves. The natural question worth asking here is why Iran would take this particular risk at all, fully aware that commercial satellite coverage makes this kind of activity nearly impossible to hide indefinitely. And the honest answer is that Tehran has run a version of this exact calculation before, and it largely worked. After the initial round of strikes, Iran discovered that simply placing a roof over a damaged building was often enough to stall meaningful international scrutiny for months at a stretch, because the practical alternative to satellite monitoring is physical, on-the-ground inspection, and Iran has systematically restricted access for International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors ever since the strikes first began. The agency's Director General has said plainly in public statements that inspections will happen eventually, but eventually is doing an enormous amount of work inside that particular sentence. In the meantime, the agency has publicly confirmed that Iran was constructing a third enrichment site near Isfahan, information that became public specifically because satellite tracking made it functionally impossible to deny, not because Iran ever volunteered it willingly. That single detail alone tells you almost everything you need to know about how this relationship actually functions in practice. Official transparency, arriving only after independent verification, forces the issue, never before it. We're just getting into how deep this pattern actually runs. So if you want to understand exactly why this particular set of images matters more than any single facility on its own, stay with me, because the next part connects pieces that most coverage has kept completely separate. That pattern is really the core of this entire story, and it's considerably bigger than just one facility. Iran's overall strategy since the earlier round of strikes hasn't been to abandon its nuclear infrastructure outright. It's been to rebuild selectively, quietly, and just fast enough to consistently stay a step ahead of the next round of inspections or the next diplomatic deadline, betting the entire time that global attention will inevitably drift somewhere else before anyone forces a genuine reckoning. Taliban 2 fits that exact pattern almost perfectly. It isn't the flagship enrichment facility. It isn't Natanz or Fordow, the sites that consistently dominate international headlines. It's a smaller, considerably less visible facility tied to weapons testing rather than uranium enrichment itself, which makes it exactly the kind of target Iran might reasonably have calculated would draw less international attention if it ever got caught. That particular calculation appears to have been badly wrong this time. Now layer in the diplomatic and political dimension, because this is precisely where the story stops being purely about concrete and rebar and starts being about genuine leverage. The June 17th memorandum was never simply a nuclear agreement sitting in isolation. It was directly tied to the release of Iranian financial assets that had been frozen for years, assets Tehran badly needs given just how deep the economic damage from ongoing sanctions and sustained military conflict has cut into the country's overall finances. Every single day that memorandum held together, Iran had genuinely more to gain from appearing to play along on paper while quietly rebuilding underneath it. That's not really a contradiction from Tehran's own perspective. It's arguably the entire point of the strategy. Freeze whatever the satellites can actually see. Rebuild whatever they can't. Keep the financial pipeline open for as long as realistically possible while restoring whatever capabilities managed to survive the earlier strikes. Iran's public posture throughout all of this has been notably contradictory, and that contradiction itself is genuinely informative. Officials have simultaneously accused the United States and Israel of unprovoked aggression against what they describe as a purely peaceful civilian program, while Iran's own deputy foreign minister has openly floated the possibility of formally withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely. That particular threat matters considerably more than it might initially sound. Only one country in the treaty's entire history has ever actually followed through on withdrawing from it: North Korea. And North Korea used precisely that withdrawal to build the clandestine weapons program that gives it a functioning nuclear arsenal today. When an Iranian official raises that specific comparison publicly, even framed as a threat rather than a formal announcement, it isn't idle rhetoric. It's a genuine signal about where the regime believes its own red lines actually sit, and how far it might be willing to go if the current diplomatic track ultimately collapses altogether. If you've made it this far, take a moment and hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next connects this specific facility to a much bigger, much more uncomfortable question about how much of Iran's program actually survived the strikes in the first place. There's also a quieter, considerably more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, and it deserves honest treatment rather than being flattened into a neat, tidy narrative. Nobody outside a very small circle of Iranian officials genuinely knows how much of the country's pre-2025 enriched uranium stockpile actually survived the strikes. Before this conflict escalated, Iran had enriched uranium at Fordow and Natanz and processed uranium metal at Isfahan at a scale that had alarmed international monitors for years. After the strikes, satellite imagery showed virtually no visible activity resuming at any of those three specific sites for months afterward. Some analysts interpreted that extended absence of visible activity as reasonably solid proof the program had been meaningfully set back in a lasting way. But an absence of visible activity is simply not the same thing as an absence of activity altogether. It remains entirely possible to move the most sensitive material underground, well away from any camera passing overhead, especially inside a country that has already spent more than a decade building elaborate physical infrastructure specifically engineered to defeat exactly this kind of surveillance. The roofs at Natanz and Isfahan exist for precisely that reason. So does Pickaxe Mountain. Iran doesn't necessarily need every single facility rebuilt to remain a serious proliferation concern. It simply needs enough surviving material, combined with enough hidden capacity, to reconstitute a meaningful program relatively quickly, once the world's attention inevitably moves elsewhere. And every piece of imagery collected since the earlier war fits a pattern entirely consistent with exactly that kind of patient, long-game strategy. Even the exact quantity of material in question matters enormously here, since experts have long noted that only a relatively small amount of highly enriched uranium, something that could plausibly fit inside a handful of secured containers, would be needed to eventually restart a weapons-relevant program from a meaningfully advanced starting point rather than from scratch. None of that analysis changes what these particular images actually mean for the ordinary people living through the daily consequences of this entire standoff. And it's genuinely worth slowing down here before moving on to what likely comes next. Every time this conflict escalates further, it stops being an abstract policy debate for the people actually living inside Iran. The country has spent the past year absorbing repeated military strikes, sustained economic strangulation from layered international sanctions, and now, on top of all of that, a domestic security crackdown tied directly to nationwide protests that erupted alongside mounting pressure from outside the country's borders. Ordinary Iranian families have essentially no meaningful influence whatsoever over whether Taliban 2 gets a fresh concrete cap poured over it, or whether construction inside Pickaxe Mountain keeps quietly expanding. They simply live under a sanctions regime that punishes the entire national economy indiscriminately, regardless of who's actually making the underlying decisions about centrifuges and enrichment thresholds behind closed doors. Grocery prices climb, currency values slide. None of that shows up in a satellite photograph, but it's every bit as real a consequence of this standoff as anything happening underground at Parchin. On the other side of this equation, American and allied intelligence agencies, satellite imagery analysts, and career diplomats have spent months trying to build an accurate, reliable picture of a program that Iran has every conceivable incentive to obscure at every turn. Knowing that a miscalculation in either direction, either badly underestimating what actually survived, or badly overreacting to what might turn out to be fairly ordinary reconstruction work, carries genuinely serious consequences for an entire region that's already absorbed more than a year of open conflict. There simply isn't a version of this story where the honest, complete answer is neat and simple, and anyone confidently telling you otherwise almost certainly hasn't looked closely enough at what these images genuinely show versus what they merely plausibly suggest. So where does the situation actually go from here? Based on everything currently sitting in the public record, there appear to be roughly 4 plausible paths forward, and they carry meaningfully different levels of risk attached to each one. The first path is that the memorandum survives in some diminished, watered-down form, with Washington treating the Taliban 2 revelations as a genuine violation, serious enough to demand new concessions from Tehran, but not quite serious enough to abandon the entire diplomatic track outright. This is likely the path officials on both sides would publicly claim to prefer, since neither government currently seems especially eager to reopen full-scale strikes while other pressing fronts, from Gulf shipping tensions to renewed friction elsewhere, are already stretching available resources thin. But here's the underlying problem with that particular path. Trust was already the single scarcest resource in this entire relationship, well before these specific images ever surfaced publicly. And catching Iran actively rebuilding weapons, relevant infrastructure roughly 3 weeks after signing an agreement explicitly promising not to makes it significantly harder for Washington to sell any continuation of that same agreement as anything other than an outright strategic mistake. Domestic political pressure inside the United States alone makes this path harder to sustain the longer these images stay in the news cycle. The second path is that this revelation becomes the formal justification for a renewed round of strikes, treating the confirmed reconstruction at Taliban 2 as proof that diplomacy has already failed outright, and that only continued sustained military pressure can reliably degrade Iran's program going forward. This is arguably the more likely outcome, given how quickly the current political environment has shown a willingness to authorize strikes once diplomatic patience appears genuinely exhausted. But the core problem here is escalation risk. Iran has already demonstrated, through its posture in the Gulf and its consistently indirect approach to retaliation, that it generally prefers proxy pressure and economic coercion over direct, open confrontation whenever possible. A renewed strike campaign specifically targeting nuclear infrastructure risks, pushing Tehran toward exactly the kind of overt weaponization threat, including a formal NPT withdrawal, that essentially everyone involved has spent years actively trying to avoid ever triggering in the first place. It's also worth remembering that Taliban 2 has already been struck twice and rebuilt at least once. There's a reasonable argument that a third strike, without addressing the underlying incentives driving reconstruction in the first place, simply resets the clock, rather than resolving anything permanently. The third path is that Iran simply continues its current strategy essentially unchanged, betting that global attention will inevitably move on to the next crisis before any meaningful consequences fully catch up with it. This is the path Iran's overall behavior, since the earlier war strongly suggests it's genuinely most comfortable following. Rebuild quietly, deny loudly and publicly, absorb whatever temporary diplomatic cost comes from occasionally getting caught, calculating all the while that the real alternative, genuinely abandoning weapons-relevant infrastructure altogether, ultimately costs the regime far more politically than another round of accusations from Washington ever realistically will. But the problem with this particular path is that commercial satellite coverage keeps steadily improving year over year. Restrictions on imagery access keep getting quietly lifted and reimposed based largely on shifting political convenience. And the underlying odds of getting caught again and again keep climbing higher with every passing month this pattern continues. The fourth and genuinely most consequential path is the one directly hinted at by Iran's own deputy foreign minister, a formal withdrawal from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, following the exact precedent North Korea set decades earlier. This remains the lowest probability outcome in the near term, specifically because it would eliminate whatever legal ambiguity currently allows Iran to frame its broader program as purely defensive and civilian in nature. And it would almost certainly trigger the kind of unified, coordinated international response Tehran has so far largely managed to avoid by deliberately operating inside the gray zone between outright compliance and outright defiance. But it's also the single outcome that would most permanently reshape this entire ongoing situation. And every fresh threat of it quietly shifts the baseline of what's considered genuinely thinkable a little further than it stood before. Once a country the size and strategic weight of Iran formally exits that treaty, walking the decision back becomes considerably harder than making it in the first place, which is exactly why analysts treat even a passing public mention of the possibility as meaningfully significant rather than dismissing it as background noise. If forced to rank these four paths by likelihood over the coming weeks, continued quiet reconstruction paired with intermittent diplomatic friction remains the most probable outcome overall, simply because it's the specific path Iran has already repeatedly shown itself willing to walk. The renewed strike scenario sits close behind as a second possibility, and would likely be triggered less by these specific images alone, and more by whatever similar activity gets caught at additional sites in the weeks ahead. The diplomatic survival path and the formal NPT withdrawal both remain considerably less likely in the immediate term, but each one carries consequences large enough that even a fairly small probability attached to either genuinely deserves close, continued attention. None of these four paths are mutually exclusive either, worth noting, since a partial version of the first path could easily give way to the second one within a matter of months if further violations surface, which is precisely why this story is worth continuing to track closely, rather than treating this single set of images as the end of the matter. Which brings this entire story back around to that 2-minute window in late June, when a satellite passed silently over a patch of desert southeast of Tehran and captured a photograph that nobody on the ground even noticed at the time. That single image didn't end anything on its own. It didn't start a new war outright, and it didn't collapse the memorandum immediately either. What it actually did was strip away the plausible deniability that had, up until that point, allowed both governments to publicly claim genuine progress while privately preparing for the very real possibility that none of it would ultimately hold together. Iran can certainly dispute the interpretation analysts have placed on what these images show. It cannot meaningfully dispute that the concrete is genuinely there, that the rebar is genuinely there, and that both appeared during precisely the window when Tehran had formally promised the entire world it would be doing neither. So here's the actual question worth genuinely sitting with once all of this settles. When a government gets caught rebuilding the exact infrastructure it had just promised to freeze, does that prove the underlying agreement was doomed from the very moment it was signed? Or does it prove something slightly different, that even a fragile, deeply mistrustful diplomatic framework is still quietly doing its job, simply by making violations visible instead of allowing them to stay comfortably invisible? There's a strange kind of value hiding inside that second interpretation, one worth sitting with for a moment. A world without any framework at all wouldn't have produced satellite images anyone bothered comparing side by side in the first place. It would have simply produced silence, and silence is exactly the outcome Tehran has spent years trying to engineer. What makes this story genuinely worth paying close attention to isn't really the concrete or the rebar themselves. It's what those two ordinary building materials represent, once you understand the full context sitting behind them. A government calculating, quite deliberately, that a diplomatic promise and a physical reconstruction project could exist simultaneously, right up until the exact moment a machine passing silently overhead proved that calculation wrong. That's the story underneath every headline generated this week, and it's very unlikely to be the last time a satellite photograph ends up mattering more than any official statement released by either government involved. Think about the strange asymmetry sitting at the center of all this. A government with an entire Ministry of Foreign Affairs, professional spokespeople, and carefully worded public statements got outmatched, at least for a moment, by a machine that doesn't issue press releases, doesn't hold briefings, and doesn't care in the slightest what either government wants the world to believe. It simply passed overhead, recorded exactly what was there, and moved on. Two ordinary photographs, taken 2 weeks apart, did more to reveal the actual state of this relationship than months of statements from officials on both sides combined. That's worth remembering the next time either government insists everything is proceeding exactly according to plan, because somewhere above the Iranian desert, another satellite is almost certainly passing overhead again right now, quietly recording whatever comes next, whether anyone down on the ground is ready for the world to see it or not.